Fear has always ruled the world. Not kings, not gods, not laws. Fear. The oldest and most loyal instrument of power. It whispers before the crown is forged, before the first soldier is trained, before the first prayer is said. Fear does not require armies or decrees. It needs only the trembling imagination of man. And every ruler, from the pharaohs to presidents, has known that whoever shapes fear, shapes reality itself. We like to believe we are governed by reason. We speak of justice, democracy, morality, progress. But beneath all those words lies something older, something primal, something that predates civilization, the terror of chaos, the fear that without control, the world will devour us. Leaders do not create that fear. They harvest it. They water it with uncertainty, fertilize it with threat, and reap obedience in return. The first philosopher of fear was not Machiavelli or Hobbes, it was nature. In the jungle, survival belonged not to the strongest, but to those who could sense danger first. Fear was the teacher of life. But as humanity built cities and laws, fear evolved. It was no longer a reaction to predators, it became a strategy of civilization. Rulers learned to mimic the voice of danger, to become both the cause of fear and its cure. That was the birth of politics. When Machiavelli wrote that it is safer to be feared than loved, he wasn't glorifying cruelty. He was diagnosing a constant. That love depends on choice, but fear does not. Love fades, but fear is renewable. The ruler who builds on affection is a gambler. The one who builds on fear is an architect. Fear can be measured, distributed, engineered. It can unite enemies, silence rebels, even sanctify violence. The genius of power is that it transforms fear into virtue. Think of the empires that came before us, the Romans, the Church, the monarchs of Europe. Each justified its authority not with morality, but with terror disguised as order. Rome promised peace through conquest, the Pax Romana, an empire of silence built on crucifixions. The Church promised salvation through obedience, preaching love while drawing its power from the fear of eternal fire. Kings ruled by divine right, but their real theology was punishment. Behind every sermon, a threat. Behind every crown, a sword. But fear alone is crude, unstable. Raw terror burns quickly. The true art of rule lies in the management of anxiety, in calibrating fear, not drowning in it. A ruler who terrifies too much breeds revolt. A ruler who comforts too much breeds weakness. The balance between panic and peace is the philosopher's gold of politics. To sustain power, fear must be subtle, soaked into the air, invisible, omnipresent. A fear that does not announce itself, but breathes inside the subject. Modern rulers mastered this. They learned to replace blood with symbols, chains with narratives, dungeons with screens. They no longer need to show the whip. They show statistics. They don't threaten execution. They threaten exclusion. Fear today wears the mask of responsibility. We are told to fear instability, to fear misinformation, to fear each other. We obey not because we are beaten, but because we are anxious. We call it safety, but it's the same architecture Machiavelli described, just digitized, sanitized, democratized. There's a philosophy behind this, an unspoken logic of control. It begins with a question every ruler has asked since the dawn of civilization. How do I make men obey without chains? The answer is elegant. Make them afraid of what happens if they don't. Fear internalizes obedience. It turns control from an external force into an inner voice. You don't need soldiers to guard people who police themselves. The most perfect government is the one that rules from within. Hobbes understood this better than anyone. He looked at the chaos of civil war and concluded that fear is the foundation of order. In Leviathan, he wrote that men surrender their freedom, not for love, not for virtue, but for protection from each other. He wasn't wrong. The state is born from fear. and sustained by it. Remove fear, and the social contract collapses. Civilization isn't built on hope, it's built on dread. That is its secret architecture. But what Hobbes saw as necessity, Machiavelli saw as art. The difference between their visions is the difference between obedience and mastery. Hobbes explained why men submit. Machiavelli explained how to make them enjoy it. To rule effectively, one must not only inspire fear, but aestheticize it. Turn it into something beautiful, meaningful, patriotic. The masses will not admit they are afraid, but they will kneel for safety, for virtue, for the greater good. Fear packaged as purpose is the most potent narcotic in history. Every ideology has done this. The left calls it justice, the right calls it tradition, religion calls it salvation. But underneath all these names is the same mechanism. Promise protection, and people will give you their souls. Promise stability, and they will forget freedom. Promise belonging, and they will accept surveillance. Promise meaning, and they will thank you for their chains. The only thing people fear more than oppression is uncertainty. That is why fear never disappears. It evolves, it modernizes, it becomes moral, it wears the language of care. Power doesn't need to terrify, it only needs to remind. Fear no longer screams from the gallows, it whispers from the headlines. It doesn't burn books, it buries them under noise. It doesn't crucify heretics, it cancels them. The method changes, the essence remains, obedience through anxiety. You might think this is bleak, but it's not cynicism, it's anatomy. Understanding fear doesn't make you a tyrant, it makes you immune to one. The rulers who use fear count on ignorance. They count on your reaction, on your outrage, on your desperate need for comfort. The moment you understand the logic behind fear, it begins to lose its grip. It becomes visible, and what is visible can no longer control you. That is why the study of fear is the highest form of philosophy. It is not about politics, it's about psychology. Fear shapes how we think, how we love, how we worship. It is the silent architect of culture, the invisible hand that moves civilizations. The philosopher who doesn't understand fear is like a physician who refuses to look at disease. Machiavelli knew this. So did Nietzsche, Freud, and every thinker who dared to touch the shadows of the human mind. Because to rule, you must first understand what terrifies men, and to be free, you must understand what terrifies you. That is the symmetry of power. The ruler and the ruled are bound by the same emotion, only their positions differ. The tyrant fears revolt, the citizen fears chaos. Both kneel before the same God, necessity. That is why fear outlasts empires. It doesn't need thrones, it lives in the human condition. Comment below, what do you think people fear more, tyranny or freedom? Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the forbidden philosophies of control. Like this if you've ever felt that fear is the real foundation of civilization. Share this with someone who still believes freedom is the natural state of man. Because the truth is darker, older, and simpler. We are ruled not by kings but by what we dread. Fear begins as survival, but civilization refines it into obedience. The savage fears death. The citizen fears disapproval. The tribesman runs from predators. The modern man runs from failure. The jungle has not vanished. It has changed shape. Its trees are offices. Its predators wear suits. And its rituals are laws. But beneath the surface, the same heartbeat remains. Fear keeps the herd together. Fear builds nations. Fear builds meaning. Every culture constructs its architecture of fear. Ancient Egypt made fear divine. The pharaoh ruled not only by armies but by cosmology. To disobey him was not rebellion, it was sacrilege. Fear of chaos was dressed as fear of God. The Greeks inherited it differently, through fate. The concept of Moira, the inescapable destiny that punishes hubris. In both, fear sustained order. It wasn't oppression, it was ontology. The universe itself demanded submission. Then came Christianity, and fear reached its theological perfection. The Church understood that the purest terror is internal. Hell was the masterpiece of social engineering, infinite punishment for invisible sins, a fear so personal it followed you into sleep. And with it came the ultimate innovation of control, the confession, people policing themselves, power outsourced to guilt. The priests did not need armies. The fear of one's own soul was enough. But religion was only the prototype. As society secularized, the old gods died, yet fear remained sacred. The modern state inherited its throne. Hobbes's Leviathan was simply a new god, made of citizens instead of angels, of bureaucracy instead of faith. The promise was the same, safety in exchange for submission. Fear became institutionalized, written into constitutions, disguised as civic virtue. You no longer feared damnation, you feared instability, and instability became the new hell. The brilliance of modern power is that it replaced terror with anxiety. Terror is loud and finite. Anxiety is quiet and endless. Terror ends with death. Anxiety lives forever. Governments, corporations, media, they no longer need to threaten destruction. They need only remind you that something might go wrong. A virus, an enemy, an economic collapse. The message is constant. Without us, the world will unravel. And so fear becomes comfort, something you cling to because it feels like structure. This is how fear becomes culture. It seeps into education, art, and morality. Children learn obedience not from cruelty, but from disappointment. Adults learn silence not from censorship, but from etiquette. We are trained to anticipate punishment before it arrives, to preempt disapproval, to self-censor, to conform. Power doesn't have to oppress us, we do it for it. The modern ruler doesn't need to demand loyalty, he only needs to define normality. That's why ideology is so powerful. It turns fear into identity. It gives you something to belong to, something to defend, something to fear losing. Ideology transforms anxiety into purpose. People no longer fear rulers, they fear exile. They fear being wrong, being isolated, being unaccepted. The crowd becomes its own prison, and every member its own warden. Fear has become democratic. Everyone polices everyone else. This is what Machiavelli hinted at when he wrote that a wise prince must learn how not to be good. He wasn't advocating evil, he was describing necessity. A ruler cannot rely on virtue because people's virtue is conditional. It evaporates under threat. What endures is fear because it requires no belief, no reason. Fear is self-sustaining. It is the one currency that never devalues. Leaders who understand this can rule indefinitely, even when their thrones crumble. But the psychology of fear has evolved further. In the age of information, fear has become infinite because knowledge has become infinite. Every fact carries its own shadow. Every revelation spawns a new uncertainty. The more we know, the more we fear. Power doesn't suppress knowledge anymore. It multiplies it. It floods the mind until fear becomes background noise, indistinguishable from reality itself. And so we live in what philosophers might call a tyranny of awareness, a state where fear is no longer imposed from above, but generated from within. The citizen scrolls through the feed, consuming fear like oxygen. Each crisis replaces the last. The apocalypse is continuous, serialized, digestible. Power doesn't need to silence dissent. It just needs to keep the anxiety alive. Fear has become entertainment. The people who believe they are woke are simply more efficiently terrified. The philosopher's role in all this should have been resistance. But instead, philosophy became therapy for the anxious age. It began to soothe instead of awaken, to justify instead of challenge. Thinkers now preach empathy, wellness, self-care. modern versions of virtue designed not to free the mind, but to pacify it. Even existentialism, once a philosophy of confrontation, has been tamed into slogans about authenticity. Fear is no longer a subject of study, it's a market. But to study fear truthfully, you must face its function. Fear does not exist to destroy, it exists to organize. It shapes behavior, defines values, and enforces order. It is the secret law beneath every moral code. The 10 Commandments are not rules of love, they are rules of avoidance. Fear of punishment, fear of shame, fear of loss. Remove those, and morality collapses. Every system of ethics is built on the assumption that man will only do good when he dreads the alternative. This is the invisible thread connecting the tyrant and the priest, the general and the teacher, the CEO and the algorithm. They all understand the same secret. Control the narrative of danger, and you control behavior. Define what is safe, and you define what is real. Fear, not reason, is the true foundation of consensus. Even science, humanity's proudest monument to rationality, relies on the fear of ignorance, the fear of being wrong. Without it, curiosity would die. And so fear becomes the philosopher's paradox. It is both the poison and the cure. It enslaves, but it also enlightens. Because to understand fear, to dissect it, name it, observe it, is to begin breaking its spell. Power depends on your blindness to its methods. The moment you see fear as a structure, as a system of design rather than chaos, you stop trembling and start thinking. That moment of clarity is rebellion. The problem is that most people don't want clarity. Clarity feels cold, isolating, merciless. Fear, for all its pain, gives meaning. It unites tribes, creates enemies, fuels purpose. Without it, life feels empty. That's why leaders never truly abolish fear. They rotate it. When one threat fades, another rises. The economy, the climate, morality, identity. The topics change. The pulse remains. Fear is the machine that keeps the world moving. Every time humanity claims to have evolved beyond it, something proves us wrong. The French Revolution promised liberty, but built the guillotine. The Soviet dream promised equality, but built the gulag. The digital revolution promised connection, but built surveillance. Every utopia begins as hope and ends as fear. Because the moment an idea demands obedience, fear becomes its currency. The moment it declares a higher purpose, it justifies coercion. Power wears the mask of salvation, and fear kneels to kiss its hand. This is not despair, it is anatomy. To understand fear is to strip away illusion. You begin to see how every virtue of power, security, morality, order, is rooted in manipulation of fear. The challenge is not to eliminate it, but to refuse to be ruled by it, to fear consciously, deliberately, without letting that fear speak for you. Comment below, what do you think society would become if fear truly disappeared? Subscribe if you want to keep peeling back the layers of control. Like this if you've ever felt that fear itself is the language of civilization. Share this with someone who still believes fear can ever be eradicated. Because fear does not vanish when you conquer it. It vanishes when you understand it. Fear does not merely preserve power, it manufactures identity. To understand that is to see why leaders, empires, and ideologies always return to it. Fear gives form to chaos. It gives the mind something to cling to, a contour in the fog. Without it, the individual dissolves. With it, he feels defined. A shared fear is the foundation of every tribe, every movement, every nation. Terror binds people together more tightly than love ever could. This is the true genius of power. It transforms fear from paralysis into belonging. It takes the raw terror of the unknown and shapes it into narrative. We are good. They are evil. The world is dangerous. But we will protect you. That sentence has ruled civilizations for thousands of years. It doesn't matter who says it. Pharaoh, priest, dictator, or president, the structure is the same. It replaces uncertainty with order, loneliness with unity, anxiety with identity. Fear is no longer something you escape, it becomes something you are. This is why every ideology begins with an enemy. Without an enemy, the movement collapses. Without a threat, people stop believing. The church had Satan. Empires had barbarians. Nations had foreigners. Modernity has systems, crises, conspiracies, climate, disease, information, misinformation. The enemy changes, but the function is identical. Fear gives shape to loyalty. A crowd without fear is a crowd without purpose. It disperses. It forgets who it is. Leaders understand this instinctively, even when they don't articulate it. They know that devotion is a form of fear transmuted into admiration. The loyal follower loves not the person, but the shelter that person represents. The tyrant, the prophet, the general, all of them survive because they embody protection. People don't kneel because they love authority. They kneel because they fear its absence. That is why even the most benevolent leaders rely on controlled fear. Without a sense of threat, the population becomes restless, decadent, unmanageable. Fear keeps them moral, disciplined, productive. Machiavelli said it best: a wise prince must ensure his subjects fear disorder more than his rule. Fear of chaos is the glue that holds civilizations together. Remove it, and man reverts to instinct. But fear alone is never enough. The most enduring forms of control arise when fear evolves into reverence, when terror becomes sacred. The leader ceases to be feared and becomes worshipped. His image absorbs both dread and hope. The subjects begin to love their fear, to mistake submission for meaning. This is not the tyranny of cruelty, it is the tyranny of devotion. Look at the great totalitarian movements of the 20th century. They did not rule by fear of death alone, but by the seduction of belonging. Hitler's genius was not his brutality. It was his understanding that people crave transcendence. He made fear divine. He offered safety through unity, destiny through obedience, salvation through destruction. Stalin did the same. Mao perfected it, and every modern populist dreams of it. The merger of terror and faith. When people love what they fear, they no longer resist. They call it destiny, duty, virtue. They defend their own subjugation because it gives them meaning. They see rebellion as blasphemy, independence as betrayal. This is the deepest level of psychological control, when fear no longer needs to disguise itself as morality, because it has become morality. The citizens police themselves not because they must, but because they believe they should. This process is not confined to politics. You can find it in corporations, religions, even relationships. The boss who demands loyalty, the guru who preaches enlightenment through surrender, the partner who manipulates affection through guilt. Fear always finds new disguises. It can sound like love, responsibility, faith, virtue, or care. It doesn't matter what mask it wears. Its essence remains the same: the will to control through insecurity. The philosopher must learn to recognize these transformations because they are subtle. Fear does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It doesn't always command obedience. It invites it. It doesn't always punish. It rewards compliance. Modern power has learned to seduce fear, to make it addictive. The individual checks the news, scrolls the feed, refreshes the chaos, addicted to anxiety because it makes him feel alive, informed, part of something larger. Fear has become participation. This is how power has transcended violence. The most sophisticated form of rule is emotional engineering. You don't dominate bodies, you shape nervous systems. You don't crush rebellion, you overload it. You make the population fear insignificance more than oppression. They will surrender willingly, just to remain seen, heard, validated. Fear no longer isolates, it networks. The modern subject does not hide from the ruler. He reports to him voluntarily, every second, through clicks and confessions. Machiavelli could not have imagined this. His world was built on swords and courts. Ours is built on algorithms and attention. But the principle is the same. Control the imagination, and you control behavior. Create a reality in which fear feels rational, and you have created the perfect system. The citizen becomes both victim and accomplice. The leader doesn't impose fear anymore. He manages it, fine-tunes it, monetizes it. This is why revolutions so often fail. They overthrow the symbol but not the structure. They destroy the tyrant but preserve the psychology. Every time power changes hands, fear changes language. The guillotine becomes the law. The whip becomes the economy. The cage becomes the social norm. Freedom is declared, but anxiety remains. The invisible tyrant, the need for protection, survives every purge. And this perhaps is the most haunting truth of all. Fear outlives ideology. It outlives gods, rulers, and revolutions. Because fear is the original architect of meaning. It's the first tool the mind used to make sense of existence. Don't die became obey. Avoid pain became believe. Every civilization is just a more elaborate version of that primal command. Leaders did not invent it. They inherited it. They simply learned how to refine it, how to make it poetic. That is the essence of what might be called the metaphysics of fear. The understanding that fear is not merely an emotion, it is a principle of order. Every system needs a gravity to hold its orbits together, and fear provides it. Remove it entirely, and the structure collapses. That's why even the most enlightened leaders rely on it quietly. They know that too much truth is destabilizing, too much freedom is unbearable. Fear keeps the world coherent. But for the individual, fear is also a teacher. To study how it is used is to reclaim some of the power it takes. When you observe how easily fear is manufactured, how it hides behind moral rhetoric, how it masquerades as compassion, you begin to see through it. You begin to act differently. You stop reacting. You start choosing. This is the beginning of what philosophers once called liberation, not from fear itself, but from being ruled by it. The difference is subtle, but absolute. To be free is not to feel safe. It is to know exactly what you fear and why. That knowledge turns obedience into strategy. It makes you unpredictable. It makes you dangerous to systems that depend on reflex. Comment below, do you think fear can ever exist without control? Subscribe for more forbidden philosophy, ideas buried under the illusions of civilization. Like this if you've ever noticed that fear doesn't disappear when you face it, it only changes form. Share this with someone who still believes devotion and terror are opposites. Because the truth is, every love story in history, political, religious, or personal, was written in the ink of fear. Every civilization in history has been a monument to fear. The pyramids, the cathedrals, the skyscrapers. Each one is an altar raised against uncertainty. The philosophers carved arguments, the rulers built armies, the priests wrote commandments. All different masks for the same purpose, to keep the abyss at bay. Fear was the invisible architect, whispering in every design. Build higher, build stronger, so you may not fall. But no matter how high humanity climbed, the whisper followed. Fear, when stripped of its disguises, is not a weakness. It is the engine of consciousness. It awakens the mind before reason does. It warns before logic arrives. It is the shadow that gives light its shape. Every thought, every belief, every moral code begins in the question, what if? And that question is born from fear. Leaders understood this long before philosophers did. They turned the pulse of fear into the rhythm of power. They realized that the heart of every human being beats to the same silent drum, survival. The ruler does not need to invent fear, he only needs to direct it. Like a sculptor molding clay, he gives it form, purpose, and name. He tells people what to fear and whom to blame. He redirects their terror away from the chaos of existence toward manageable enemies, foreigners, heretics, rebels, the other. It doesn't matter who fills the role as long as the ritual continues. The purpose of power is not to remove fear, it is to distribute it. But the most enduring rulers discovered something subtler still. Fear is not just an emotion, it's an energy. It can be converted, channeled, refined into awe, reverence, or devotion. The leader who truly understands fear no longer threatens his people, he inspires them. His presence alone becomes a form of reassurance. He represents the barrier between the people and their deepest anxieties. That's why citizens forgive corruption, but not weakness. They don't want honesty, they want protection. The leader's true function is not to lead, it is to contain fear. This is why every empire needs its mythology. Rome had its gods, the church had its heaven, modernity has its progress. Each is a narrative of safety, a collective illusion that tomorrow will be better. Hope is fear domesticated. The citizen worships the idea that someone, somewhere, knows what they're doing. That civilization is not an accident, that there is a plan. But behind that illusion, the mechanism of fear hums quietly, keeping everything in motion. And yet, there is another layer to this story, one Machiavelli only hinted at, one few have dared to face. What happens when fear no longer comes from outside but from within? When the ruler learns not to frighten the people, but to make them frighten themselves. That is the final evolution of control. The citizen who fears his own thoughts will never need a tyrant. The philosopher who fears irrelevance will censor his own ideas. The believer who fears doubt will enslave his own soul. The body no longer needs chains when the mind provides them. You can see this everywhere in the modern world. We are conditioned to fear the wrong things, not the systems that rule us, but the loss of comfort they provide. Not the noise that manipulates us, but the silence that might reveal it. Not the decay of truth, but the loneliness of thinking for ourselves. Fear has been internalized so perfectly that we call it morality. We call it responsibility. We call it sanity. And we smile while it rules us. But beneath this psychological machinery lies a paradox, the same paradox that haunted Machiavelli, Hobbes, Nietzsche, and every philosopher who touched the nerve of fear. Without it, meaning collapses. Without fear, there is no order, no ambition, no drive. Fear is the tension that keeps the human condition alive. To destroy it completely would be to erase the very thing that makes us human. The goal, therefore, is not to escape fear, but to master it, to become conscious of it, to see it without being consumed by it. This is what the ancient Stoics meant when they spoke of tranquility, what the Buddhists meant by awakening, what Nietzsche meant by becoming the Übermensch. All these philosophies circle the same center, the transformation of fear into awareness. To rule others, one manipulates fear. To rule oneself, one observes it. The leader who masters others commands their dread. The philosopher who masters himself dissolves it. The former builds empires, the latter builds freedom. The tragedy is that humanity rarely chooses the second path. Most prefer the comfort of a ruler to the burden of autonomy. To live without fear is to live without excuses, without guarantees, without gods. It demands the kind of courage that feels like madness. That is why those who conquer fear are always outsiders, heretics, mystics, thinkers who walk alone. Society does not understand them because society is built upon shared anxiety. To transcend fear is to step outside the human game. But that is also where true sovereignty begins. The one who faces fear without intermediaries, without priests, leaders, or ideologies, becomes ungovernable. Not rebellious in noise, but invincible in silence. He cannot be bribed with comfort or controlled with panic. He sees through the illusions of safety and danger alike. He becomes, in the deepest sense, free. And that is the one thing every system of power dreads, a mind that no longer trembles. Machiavelli knew this. That's why he stopped short of writing a book on liberation. He understood that fear could be described, but not destroyed. He taught rulers to use it wisely because he knew humanity was not ready to live without it. He chose to instruct the architects of power rather than the dreamers of utopia. Perhaps he feared that if everyone saw the truth, civilization would collapse into chaos. Perhaps he was right. But the time for silence has long passed. The machinery is visible now. The fear is transparent. The question is no longer how rulers use terror to rule, but why we still let them. Fear, once exposed, begins to rot. It loses its divine smell. You start to see how absurd it is, how artificial. You start to notice the hands that move it, the politicians, the prophets, the media, the moralists. They all feed on your anxiety. They sell you safety like merchants selling water in a flood. They promise peace while manufacturing the very panic that keeps them relevant. Once you see that cycle, you stop being a customer. You stop being a believer. You stop being ruled. That is the beginning of a different kind of rule. The rule over yourself. It's not loud. It's not heroic. It's quiet, cold, precise. It doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means choosing where to place it. You fear wasting your life more than losing it. You fear blindness more than failure. You fear living as a copy more than dying unknown. That kind of fear does not enslave. It awakens. It becomes fuel for clarity, not chains of obedience. The philosopher of fear does not seek courage. He seeks lucidity. Courage still depends on fear for its meaning. Lucidity transcends it. It turns fear into understanding, and understanding into power. That is the transformation rulers fear most, when their subjects stop panicking and start observing. When the citizen becomes a philosopher, and the philosopher becomes immune to threats. That is when the machine starts to crack. So the next time you feel fear, pause. Don't run from it. Don't fight it. Watch it. Ask who benefits from it. Ask what it wants you to do. If the answer leads you toward obedience, then the fear is not yours. It was planted there. But if the answer leads you toward awareness, then that fear is gold. It's the last prison door unlocking. Comment below, do you think humanity could survive without fear, or would it collapse without something to obey? Subscribe for more forbidden philosophy, truths buried beneath the machinery of control. Like this if you've ever felt that your fears might not belong to you. Share this with someone who still believes fear is a flaw, not a weapon. Because the truth is simple and eternal. He who commands fear commands men. He who understands fear commands himself.